This is a close-up. And this is a close-up as well. As you can tell, they look very different even though the subject, the lighting and the frame size are exactly the same. This is the impact different lenses and focal lengths can have on an image. In today's video we will learn how to choose the right focal length for any type of shot you want to create, as well as all the different types of lenses that are available with their pros and cons. Without further ado, let's get to it. Before we start, if you haven't watched my video about the exposure triangle, I suggest you do so first, because it will make this part a lot easier to understand. So what is a lens exactly? Well, the easiest description would be it's the eye for your camera. Without the eye, the camera is blind, so to give your camera sight, you put a lens on it. There are different types of lenses you can put on your camera. A wide lens, for example, will give your camera a wide field of view, but it will make the background look far away and small. A telephoto lens, on the other hand, will make the field of view very narrow, but it will bring the background closer to you and make it bigger. Every lens in between wide and telephoto will keep things looking natural, just like in real life. Let's call those the normal lenses. So how do we know what type of lens we have, a wide, a telephoto or a normal lens? For that we need to look at two things, the sensor size of the camera and the focal length of the lens. Let's start with the lens. There are often a lot of numbers printed on a lens. So what do they mean? The focal length is represented by a number or range of numbers followed by two letter M's, which stands for millimeter. There is also often a decimal number or a range of decimal numbers printed on the lens. Those numbers represent the aperture. When we only see one number for the aperture and one number for the focal length, that means that the lens has fixed aperture and focal length. When we see a range of numbers, it means that the lens has variable aperture or focal length. A variable focal length means that this is a zoom lens. We can zoom from the smallest number to the biggest number. A fixed focal length means that this is a prime lens, so we can't zoom at all. A variable aperture works slightly different. First of all, there can only be a variable aperture on a zoom lens. All prime lenses have a fixed aperture. When I say fixed, I don't mean that you cannot change the aperture. It only means that the aperture will stay the same throughout the whole range of the focal length. Since there is no range of focal lengths on a prime lens, that's why there can be no variable aperture. On a zoom lens, however, if you see a variable aperture, that means that on the wide end, the maximum aperture will be the first number, and on the telephoto end, the maximum aperture will be the second number. So the aperture will change when you zoom in. And where the change takes place depends on the lens. So what focal lengths are considered wide, normal and telephoto? I would say that anything up to 30 mm is considered wide. Anything from 30 to 70 can be considered a normal lens, and from 70 up we can consider it a telephoto, but it also depends on the sensor size. Sensors in cameras come in a variety of sizes. I will not be going through all the different sizes here, I will just name the couple of most common ones. First we have the full frame. This is the sensor size that will produce the exact focal length you see on the barrel of the lens. If you put a 50 mm on the full frame sensor, you will get exactly the 50 mm field of view. Then we have the APS-C sensor. This is a sensor size that has a crop factor of 1.5 times. That means that if we put a 50 mm lens on the APS-C sensor, we will get instead a 75 mm field of view. So a 50 mm on a full frame sensor will be considered a normal lens, and 50 mm on an APS-C sensor will be considered a telephoto lens. A Micro Four Thirds sensor, however, will even go further than that. It has a crop factor of 2, which means that the 50 mm lens on a Micro Four Thirds sensor will be more like a 100 mm lens. This is why sensor size must always be considered when choosing lenses for the focal length you want to achieve. So basically we have two types of lenses, prime lenses and zoom lenses. Zoom lenses have one obvious advantage over prime lenses, and that is the fact that you can zoom in and have multiple focal lengths with only one lens. Prime lenses, however, often have a bigger aperture than zoom lenses. They're also often lighter and cheaper. The only real con is that you don't have an option to zoom in. This means that you will need to buy multiple lenses to have the same range as a zoom lens. Now, some people might say, what if I just buy a prime lens and if I want to get a tighter shot, I will just walk closer to the subject to achieve the same effect as zooming in. Now, this is a mistake a lot of beginner filmmakers and people who don't understand how focal lengths work make. Let me explain what I mean. I am using a camera with a full frame sensor, so all focal lengths produce an accurate field of view. So let's say we have a 20mm prime lens. I want to shoot a scene of a subject reading a book. We want to show the location, the title of the book, and the reaction of the subject's face while he is reading. Now let's do the same thing with a 50mm. I will try to match the framing as closely as I can. If we look at each shot, you can see how much difference there is between the scenes. Notice the background and the way the face looks in the close-up. This is why walking towards the subject is not the same as zooming in. Now let's take a look at how different focal lengths affect the subject's face and the background. I have kept the aperture the same for all the shots. As you can see, the difference between the 14 and the 200mm is huge. So what did we learn? The wider you go, the further away the background will appear to be. Also, the subjects that are close to the lens will be distorted. The more we zoom in, the closer the background gets to the subject. It will compress the space between the subject and the background, making them appear closer to one another. Another thing we need to consider is depth of field. Now it may appear that depth of field changes based on the focal length. This is however not the case. There is an illusion of a shallower depth of field on the telephoto side. This is however because the background is magnified, which also magnifies the blurred parts of it. As long as the subject is the same size in the frame, the depth of field will stay the same at all focal lengths. However, do note that to make your depth of field more shallow, you need to get closer to the subject. This can be by physically moving the camera closer or by zooming in, which will make your subject appear closer. Gerald Undown made a video explaining how depth of field works in a much better detail, like he does with all his videos. Link to that video will be in the description. Focal length has also an effect on movement, both movement within a frame as well as camera movement. If we move the camera forward or backward, the wide focal length will emphasize that movement much more than a tight focal length will. However, if we do a parallax movement, the tight focal length will have a much faster moving background. So changing the focal length can create a different effect for the same type of movement. That is something to keep in mind. I will be making a video about camera movement in the future. So knowing how a focal length can affect our image, how can we use this tool to help us tell better stories using our visuals? Well, there are more than 1,000 ways to do it, I can't cover all of them, but here are a few examples to get you started. Knowing that a tighter focal length will make the background spin faster, we can use that to create a disorienting effect, like Michael Bay does in a lot of his movies. Another example would be in a chasing scene. Let's say a scary bad guy is chasing a helpless girl. While she's running towards the house for safety, we can film an over the shoulder of the bad guy using a telephoto lens. So the compression will bring him closer to the subject, adding to the suspense. When we film the over the shoulder of the house, we can do the opposite. If we use a wide angle lens in this shot, the house will appear further away. A wide focal length can also be used to show our subjects under the influence of drugs or alcohol. The distortion of the face, combined with some camera movement, will communicate being drunk or high effectively, like in this example. Those are just a few ways we can use focal lengths as a storytelling tool. Now, as I said, there are countless more ways, but I can't possibly cover them all. If you enjoyed the video and learned something new, let me know in the comments below. Also, consider subscribing to my channel. For now, I wish you a good day. Until next time.